throughout the world gives Jews the right to want a Jewish state as a place of potential refuge, if it were needed again, and also that Israel has the capacity and has shown through its remarkable institutions, its independent Supreme Court, its free press, its free elections, its culture of self-criticism, that it has the capacity to be a country that offers freedom and dignity not only to Jews but to non-Jews. You know, with all of the terrible things that Israel does to the Arab citizens of Israel, they still don't want to leave. They still don't want to be part of a Palestinian state. They want to be part of Israel. And I think that shows that, in fact, there is the capacity within Zionism to bring Herzl's idea to life of a liberal democratic Jewish state.
So come back to your basic scenario that you're essentially saying that Israel is headed increasingly towards becoming an undemocratic state.
Yes, I would never call Israel an apartheid state today, but both Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, who are not radical leftists, have said that if Israel doesn't find a way of disengaging itself from the West Bank, and ultimately the West Bank becomes annexed to Israel and it becomes impossible to give up, then in fact it will either have the choice of giving those Palestinians the vote, in which the Jewish character of the state will be imperiled, or in fact it will be something of an apartheid state in the limited sense that it will have a very large group of people who, by virtue of their religion, are not allowed to vote. And that's the fear.
So your worst fear is realised. What then? Not just within Israel. What then back in the United States, which is Israel's great friend and it's been fundamental to Israel's survival?
It's interesting. When Olmert made that statement in which he raised the prospect of Israel becoming an apartheid state, he said, very, I think, perceptively, he said the Jews of the diaspora will abandon us. I think he is largely right. It is so much, I can only speak for the United States, but it is so much within the self-perception and identity and character of American Jewry that if American Jewry cannot make any credible case that our democratic values are represented in Israel, it will become a fundamental divide between our community and Israel. Not as much within the Orthodox population, but within the large bulk of American Jews. There will be, again, what I think of this as this kind of existential shrug and say, what a tragedy, but we're Americans.
But how does that then impact back on the broader American foreign policy with regard to Israel?
You know, I think what would happen...
There's a lot of self-interest.
What will happen in that set of circumstances is that those Americans who don't particularly care about human rights and liberal democracy will still be supportive of Israel because, frankly, Israel is against the Muslims. I mean, you know, if you like the Zionism of the Christian right, you know, Tom DeLay was one of the most powerful Republican leaders, Christian right leaders, said very explicitly several years ago, actually Dick Armey said it, not Tom DeLay, Dick Armey, who's now one of the de facto heads of the Tea Party movement, he said, I would really have no problem if they put the Palestinians on buses and sent them to Jordan. What would be the problem with that? This is the land that God gave to the Jews. If you're comfortable with that kind of Zionism, you will find some on the Christian right in the United States who will be supportive of that kind of Zionism. But I think you will lose those people in the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community for whom Zionism is, it has to be wrapped up in the idea that this is going to be a state that respects human rights of all people.
But the danger, putting America to one side, the danger is that Israel becomes increasingly isolated in the world and therefore increasingly vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that there is this great fear that Israel's policies, look, some of the criticism of Israel around the world is a genuine response to Israeli policies that I think are tragic and self-defeating, and some of it is darker in character and really would be interested in Israel's destruction, or at least Israel's destruction as a Jewish state, and uses these policies as a pretext. But essentially, both of those kinds of criticism gain strength from the policies that Israel pursues in the West Bank. And my fear is that as Israelis feel more and more isolated and more besieged, they turn on their own domestic critics. One of the most troubling things that's happening in Israel today is a series of attacks that have been launched on Israeli human rights organizations, now a series of investigations that are being launched of Israeli universities wanting to go through their syllabi, claiming that they're not patriotic. This is very disturbing in a liberal democracy. It's Israeli human rights organizations. It's the ability of Israel to have lefty academics, even wacky lefty academics. That's part of what makes Israel a thriving liberal democracy. And the threat to that, I think, is very, very disturbing. And so, I mean, when I see people talking about the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, which as it relates to Israel as a whole, which I emphatically oppose, I think we have to understand that if you're going to beat that movement, you're going to have to beat it fundamentally by changing Israeli policy. You're not going to beat it by creating a new public relations firm. You're going to beat it by actually changing some of the policies that actually fuel so much of this hostility.
Okay, question over here.
Hello. Sorry, I'm a little scared to ask my question after that last one. With what you're talking about with regard to the problem of the Israeli state undermining itself from within with regard to abuses of liberal democracy, with the language that you've described, the Palestinians and the Arabs and Muslims in general being described by Israeli politicians, for me that calls to mind W.H. Auden writing in September 1939, those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Would that be your fear then, because it does lend itself to that comparison, the language with which you're saying some politicians are talking about the Palestinians? It does lend itself to a comparison of how the Jews themselves were once described in various parts of the world. Is that your fear, that some aspects of the Israeli government are heading towards the worst of what was once done to them?
No, I do not. My fear is not that Israel would set up concentration camps for the Palestinians. I do not think that will ever happen. But I do fear that there could be a process of dehumanization and disenfranchisement that could lead to more and more mainstream calls for the expulsion of Palestinians from Israeli society. That was the position that Effie Atam gave voice to. Lieberman has it in a softer version, where he suggests that Israel should pay its Arab citizens to leave the country, maybe pay the Palestinians in the West Bank to leave the country as well. But I think that's a very sinister rhetoric. But it's not. In fact, there was a poll done by the Israeli Democracy Institute in 2010, which showed that 53% of Jewish Israelis supported the idea of trying to voluntarily convince Arabs to leave the state of Israel. And for me, that's not the Holocaust. I don't think it ever will be the Holocaust, but it's disturbing enough. And I think the Palestinian citizens of Israel, that 20%, represent a real challenge, because they don't want Israel to be a Jewish state, which is not really that surprising because they're not Jewish themselves. They would like Israel to be a secular state. It's going to be difficult, but the way to make them loyal to Israel, to come to terms with Israel, is not by demonizing them and disenfranchising them. It's dealing with the fundamental inequities in their lives. And by abusive policy towards their Palestinian cousins in the West Bank and in Gaza, you only alienate them further and make them further prone to radicalization. So it's a great challenge to Israel to bring these people fully into the mainstream of Israeli society and politics. But I think the way Lieberman is doing it is precisely the wrong way.
Okay, over here.
I understand you've described yourself as a pessimist, but can I ask you for your best case scenario, both in terms of the establishment of an effective liberal diaspora Zionism and in terms of what happens within Israel itself?
I guess the optimism that I have in Israel comes from people like Tzipi Livni. Not that she's perfect in any regard, but what's striking to me about Tzipi Livni is she was someone who spent her whole life on the right, the child of revisionist parents, greater Israel, and she saw what was happening. She saw this impending disaster of a state that was going to have to choose between democracy and being a Jewish state, and she made a radical switch. And she is now, I think, a very authentic supporter of a two-state solution. The fact that that switch can take place is a source of some optimism to me. I think as it regards the diaspora, I think that people in the diaspora have to have the self-confidence to believe that they can be in opposition, even in deep opposition to the Israeli government, we're not feeling they're losing their connection to the state of Israel. I think it's understandable. A lot of people in diaspora very much want to maintain this connection to the state of Israel. But I think we need to remind ourselves that our connection to the state of Israel, our love to the state of Israel, doesn't have to go through the guy who happens to be in power at that point. There are so many other points of connection to the state of Israel that can produce an authentic Zionism that can be even in opposition to that state. I mean, and it can be even the sense of admiration and awe you feel for those Israelis who are struggling against the policies of the state. That can be a source of Zionism. And I think we need to tell young people in particular that that is an acceptable form of Zionism. And I think we haven't done that very well.
Last question. Yeah.
Excuse me. Given that Lieberman, Shas, the religious party, and all others that are members of the government arrived there by dint of the democratic process, by voting, getting mandates in the Knesset, and by the dint that the Israeli government and the democratic process is a genuine one, unlike all the other countries from the Atlantic to Afghanistan in the east, why should Israel be needed to be beholden to American Jewry? Orthodox, Zionist, liberal, secular, or any other. And as a matter of a comment, to suggest that Israel is an apartheid state is A, wrong, and B, obscene.
Right.
Well, I think I explicitly said I do not think Israel is an apartheid state, but I did cite that both Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak have warned about the potential if Israel finds itself unable to disentangle itself from the West Bank. It's true that Shas and Lieberman were elected in a democratic election, but it's also important to remember that a very significant part of the land that Israel controls is not a democracy, the West Bank. In the West Bank, Palestinians are not allowed to vote. So it seems to me that it would be a mistake to use Israeli democracy as an alibi for whatever Israel does, when the struggle is for Israeli democracy, and the threat is that unless Israel can disgorge this part of this territory in which is not democratic, it threatens the democratic character of the whole state. And in addition, I didn't only talk about democracy, I talked about liberal democracy. And liberal democracy is very much about minority rights, freedom of expression, equality under the law. And that is what it seems to me Lieberman and Shas threaten when Lieberman tries to prevent Arab-Israeli parties from running in the elections because they oppose the Gaza war, as he did in 2009. Or when leaders of Shas make blatantly racist comments about Israeli Arabs. And this is the housing minister who said he did not want the Arab-Israeli population to spread. And so that's what I mean by there being a concern, for me at least.
Very brief one to close because we're just past time. You obviously, in writing this essay, were hoping to excite some reasonable and healthy debate in the United States. The debate that's followed, would you regard it as healthy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, there are lots of people who criticize me on various grounds, and that's perfectly fine. I was concerned about some friends, close friends, people whose views I really respect, and those conversations have actually been very valuable. I found that every community, I can only speak for the United States, but every community has its public discourse and it has its private discourse. And sometimes the private discourse is more subversive than people always recognize. And for me, in a way, the response to the essay has been an introduction to, in some ways, how subversive that discourse can be. People who came up to me who I always assumed were very, very far to the right, who have themselves talked about their very deep anxieties. There's a guy who I go to synagogue with. He's kind of right-leaning guy, and he said to me the other day, he said, we were watching our children play, and he said, I don't think Israel's going to be there for them. And I said, well, what do you exactly mean by that? And he said, I'm not really sure exactly, but I just have this fear that Israel's not going to be there for them. And that's this sense of dread that I think does exist, even in surprising corners of the American Jewish community, that Israel is going to be a place that it becomes unrecognizable to us. And so I hope that more of these difficult issues are brought to light, and that we struggle for the Israel that we want to see.
Now, since you're a pessimist, Peter, it's hard for us to end on an optimistic note. But I'll quit while we're ahead. Peter Beinart, thank you very much. Would you please? Thank you.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.